You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968, and the Nixon White House after that, had two enemies. The anti-war left, and black people. You understand what I'm saying. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on evening news. Did we know we were allowed on the drugs? Of course we did.
Today we'll be talking about an issue of federal policy that is easy to make a snap judgment on. Most people can agree that drugs are bad. The issue seems to lie in which are bad and how bad they are. The discussion being centered around this makes it difficult for us to discuss the other major issues with these policies and the way they are enforced in the communities they are targeting. Now let's talk about history. Laws controlling the sale and consumption of drugs have been around since the late 19th century, and they've been racist the whole time. Fun. Most drug laws are pushed on a moral and safety platform, but in reality serve to discriminate against whatever group is unpopular at the time. The first anti-opium laws were passed in 1875 in San Francisco. This is because the new ways of Chinese immigrants were users of opium, and by criminalizing opium, you could effectively criminalize being a Chinese immigrant. Thus began the use of anti-drug laws for racism, which is a proud tradition that we continued for centuries since. Later, in the 1910s, Mexican immigration levels started rising, and the people in power decided that they wanted to criminalize that as well. So in came marijuana laws. Mexican immigrants were heavy users of the drugs. And yet again, some may think, this was at the beginning of the century. Surely we stopped doing that when we got to the civil rights movements in the 1960s. You are almost right. Huge progress was being made in the 60s and 70s towards decriminalizing marijuana, a drug that science agrees to be less harmful than alcohol. Then companies came along. Major brands and retail stores like 7-Eleven started selling marijuana paraphernalia, and even marketing kids. In order to protect teens and children from marijuana, states where it's legalized, like California and Colorado today, make edibles, which are foods that the drug has been infused in, illegal if they're shaped like things kids usually eat. But people made them like things kids ate back in the day. So there was a giant moral panic about how our kids would be in danger from these companies that were selling weed, and all of the progress that was on marijuana legalization got completely reversed in the late 70s. And then, in the early 60s, a new drug got criminalized, crack. Crack was a drug mostly used by black communities and people who were part of the anti-war movement. But, as you saw in the quote at the beginning, it wasn't really about the drug. Even the politicians at the time knew what they were doing by criminalizing the drugs, and over half a century later, we still have those drugs. Crack is effectively just a different way of putting the chemicals in cocaine in your body. Yet, the sentence for dealing, that is selling, crack is 50 to 1 with that of cocaine, a drug primarily used by white, rich people.
Our job is never easy because drug criminals are ingenious. They work every day to plot a new and better way to steal our children's lives, as they've done by developing this new drug, crack.
To get an idea of how politics works in the real world at a federal level, I reached out to a friend of a friend, Mr. Dylan Nurse. So, first question is, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Dylan Nurse. I am Congressman David Scott's district director.
How did you get into politics?
So my father was a political journalist. And so growing up, sitting around the table, talking about it all the time, it just kind of was in my blood.
Well, because our project is about how federal policy impacts local people, do you know how Congress people handle the impacts of the laws that they write on everyday people?
Well, we see it all the time. Constituent service is first and foremost about making sure that people have a conduit between their elected lawmakers who are making these laws and the people who are enforcing them. So, The executive branch is responsible for implementing them. The legislative branch is responsible for making them, and the judiciary is responsible for interpreting them. We see it frequently in newer laws. So if you look at like the CARES Act, or some of the legislation around the pandemic, where it was written to conform to an emergency, and the circumstances have changed and fluctuated, and sometimes the courts have said, the emergency powers no longer apply because we're not in the pandemic. But are we in the pandemic still? There's still thousands of people dying. That's something that we deal with. I think probably the best example that we're seeing on the ground right now is rent assistance. The passage of the American Recovery Act we included legislation that said rental and mortgage assistance would be provided. The problem that we're running into is the legislative decision was it would go through the Department of Treasury. We already have those programs generally through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And they go through what are called entitlement communities. So communities that have a large enough population, which I believe it's either 50 or 100,000 people. I think it's 100. Otherwise, the money goes to the state, and then the state disperses it through a competitive grant application process. The problem is that the Department of Treasury isn't used to overseeing the disbursement of funds in this particular manner. So because we wrote it in such a way that it was going through the Department of the Treasury instead of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, various states have been receiving funds and dispersing them in different ways that aren't necessarily used to. I mean, like there are a lot of ways in which the federal government touches our lives, and congressional offices are the way that you touch back. And we take the stories of people who have had trouble with a certain process or who fall through the gaps and things. We bring them up to our DC offices, and we talk with our colleagues and say, this didn't work the way you intended. Make sure that you're considering this the next time you do a go at legislation like this.
How could, say, your average high school student get more involved in, feeding back into the process of politics?
I think the optimal ways to get involved are, being a part of the process. So whether that's an internship or just volunteering, so that you have the opportunity to get to know people, to get to know the processes. So I found that being an intern, even though I was 17 years old, I really had a great opportunity to get to know what a congressional office was like. But it ended up becoming a job for me after I left because I knew some of the people who were there.
Hopefully, with our generation starting to realize what an issue this is, we will slowly but surely make progress on the issue of drug policy and its racialized abuse. I've added some further reading/sources in the description below and as a link here on screen. Thank you for watching, and stay safe and happy.